Okay, so my name's Natalie Fine,
I'm August Argood.
William Dudley.
Gunnar Dahlstrom.
and this is our final video project on our two books.
So Natalie and I did Reading Like a Historian, Teaching Literacy in Middle and High School History Classrooms by Sam Weinberg. So, in the first chapter titled Did Pocahontas Rescue John Smith, Weinberg talks about how to start your class with a manageable historical problem. Basically, he wants us to present history as a series of problems to be explored, and he wants students to consider, are primary sources always primary? What this means is that students should challenge the idea that firsthand or primary accounts are the most reliable source for understanding the past. In addition, teachers should also start with the known. Basically, what this means is that for students, familiarity means that they are more likely to be interested in the topic and problem. In chapter 2, he talks about teaching students about what is knowable. Basically, students may struggle to understand what can and can't be known. So by learning to wrestle with the messiness of evidence, it gives students a chance to engage in legitimate historical work. Weinberg also talks about a chance to explore how myths become interwoven with history. Basically, this is talking about how factual inaccuracies often creep into the historical record, and teaching students to be critical of how myths become kind of interchangeable with history is essential to helping them develop a sense of skepticism and a key eye for evidence. Weinberg also talks about using visual sources as an alternative primary source, and they can be invaluable in the process of historical inquiry. So chapter 3 talks about the importance of context. History demands that we understand the differences between contemporary standards and the standards of the past. In other words, things that were okay in society now were probably not necessarily okay in the past. Weinberg also talks about slowing down student reading. A lot of primary sources require that students read slowly and pay attention to word choice and nuance. Weinberg uses a lot of Lincoln's writing as evidence for this, because if you kind of take it at face value, it seems like Lincoln is being very hypocritical, but you have to look at the nuance of what he is saying. And also, Weinberg talks about challenging student misconceptions. As students consider the context of primary sources, incomplete ideas about the past are challenged. So students often come in with a kind of they already have ideas formed about certain historical events, and as they read primary documents, these documents can challenge those preconceptions. Lastly, chapter 4, Weinberg talks about puzzles, questions, and the process of history. So basically, Weinberg is asking teachers to challenge students to think more critically, more creatively, and more historically. Again, he wants students to understand sources in the context of when and where they were written. So situate documents in place and time, essentially. And also change over time, which is something that I often ask my students to do in essays, which is students also often have this assumption that the layout of the world is exactly the same as it is today, 100 or 1,000 years ago, when in reality, many of the norms have evolved. Lastly, Weinberg discusses connections to today, so making the historical events relevant. How do events of the past connect to questions such as immigration policy, presidential politics, etc. And now I'm going to hand it off to Natalie.
Okay, so for chapter 5, electricity and women's work, who really benefits and when, it brings up the letter Miss Lathrop, which was a letter written to Thomas Edison that explains how his contribution to electricity has made her and her family's lives so much easier. So in this lesson that Weinberg displays for this chapter, it focuses on representativeness. So how much can we learn from just analyzing one letter? So corroborating the letter with other documents and data sources pushes students to read more critically and place the letter in historical text. Also, this section focuses on point of view, so comparing historical perspectives. By having multiple historical perspectives can give a more complete view of history and help students see complex causes and affect relationships. And then lastly, historical evidence using numerical data and the internet to understand the past. So through web searches and reading accompanying historical sources, students encounter statistical data that allow them to compare the letter to contemporaries, as well as gives students the opportunity to engage with new forms of evidence and teaches them to be tentative in the conclusions they draw. I like to focus on the targeted list of skills that are composed in the 3 different scenarios that Weinberg gives in this book, because they help with EdTPA, because EdTPA focuses on what are the student outcomes and skills that students will gain through your lesson segment that you're teaching them. So some of those skills from this chapter are corroborating sources, contextualizing sources, questioning sources to identify representativeness, perspective recognition, evidence-based thinking and argumentation, identifying consequences of new technology, so cause and reflect relationships. So chapter 6, dust to eat, dust to breathe, dust to drink. It's pretty much talking about how history is full of stories in regards to the story of the Dust Bowl, which is what it focuses on from history. So it talks about how stories require making innumerable choices. So whose story do we teach or tell in history? What events will we focus on? What are the critical specifics for weaving an accurate story about the past? So how we share what happened in bygone days and how we make sense of the past and what initially piques our interest to explore the past and its specifics and significance is what we kind of focus our stories on. And then also historians move beyond descriptive stories to tell explanatory stories. So another key feature of historical stories is that they must stick to documentary record and be supported by evidence, so primary sources mainly. Also, this section had a lot more of in-depth targeted skills from the 3 different scenarios as well. That I'm not going to read them all because there was a lot more for these scenarios, but they help with, like I said, the skills that we need our students to be able to learn through history and as well as addressed in the EdTPA. Chapter 7, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. So this one is pretty much talking about how students know so much about Rosa Parks, but what they know about it has become restored by myth and legend. And so it's hard to get the actual truth or for them to understand the actual truth. So that's where it faces some challenges for students when teaching with some primary sources because sources of information always contain errors. And we also grasp tightly on our prior beliefs. So somebody can tell you something about Rosa Parks, but if you believe something completely different, it's going to be hard to believe what the other person says, even if they do have evidence. So that's why I focus on why teach about Rosa Parks. It's because it's a familiar story with unfamiliar twists. So pretty much determining the basic facts in an event is central not only to historical understanding, but our entire legal system. And then also factual detective work is complicated, especially when trusted sources like encyclopedias and textbooks contradict one another. And then it also offers students the opportunity to think hard about different sources and different kinds of evidence. And it's also whom does history remember and forget, and teach about social movements. Some of the targeted lists that and skills that I thought were good for EdTPA was that it focused on analyzing legal codes, close reading, questioning narrative accounts, and distinguishing between myth and history. And then lastly, Chapter 8 is called To Blink or Not to Blink, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is pretty much Weinberg kind of like lashes out at textbooks, saying that they often overlook and minimize too much. So he recommends the opening up the textbook approach, which changes the text from an inner authority, always issuing the final word, to a more historical source that can be critically evaluated like any other source. And then he also defines corroboration, because we see that a lot in the targeted lists of skills that I've been posting. And it means a practice at the core of historical reasoning is the act of comparing different accounts in order to piece together an accurate picture of what happened. So pretty much taking a whole bunch of primary and secondary sources to accurately say what happened or determine history. And then he focuses on why I teach about the Cuban Missile Crisis is because the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis is a story that gradually reveals itself over time, and then also corroborating sources. Some of the targeted skills that would be good to reference on EdTPA, I was thinking constructing a narrative based on evidence, and then also building an explanation of the past events based on sources and perspective recognition. So that pretty much concludes part 1 of our presentation, and we're now moving on to part 2.